The Minds of Meaning Podcast. The Minds of Meaning Podcast. A podcast where we grow together in understanding the unique ways that God has created us. Here's our host, Austin Anderson.
Welcome to the Minds of Meaning Podcast, a podcast where we learn the unique ways that God has created us. My name is Austin Anderson. This is the third episode of the Communication Leadership Series, where we are interviewing communication educational leaders within Christian higher education. Dr. Bethany Keeley-Jonker is the Department Chair and Professor of Communication Arts at Trinity Christian College in Palos Heights, Illinois, where she has been since 2012. Her research interests include how Christians have and should interact with public life, historical examples of religious talk from politicians, and political talk from religious leaders. Additionally, she enjoys thinking how Christians engage in popular media, including a connection between the heroes and heroines of Star Wars and their tie to biblical heroes from Hebrews 11. She has also written as a freelance writer for several publications, including Think Christian, an online publication from Reframe Ministries, whose motto is no such thing as secular. Her PhD is in speech communication with a rhetoric emphasis at the University of Georgia. Her master's degree is also from Georgia in speech communication, and her bachelor's degree is from Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in communication arts and sciences. Her ability to think creatively allows us to have great conversation on education, leadership, and communication. Without further ado, here's Dr. Bethany Keeley-Jonker. I read a little bit into your background, and you have a very interesting story of how you kind of got here into communications. What led you personally, would you say, to be passionate in researching and teaching communications?
You know, I was thinking about this. You have to go all the way back to my undergrad experience, which is probably true for a lot of scholars. I came into college. I'd always loved language, reading, writing. I had some interest in theater, although I was kind of a mousy child. My auditions for theater didn't work out for me, but interested in storytelling and how language works in the world. And then I just kept taking comm courses to fill. I went to Calvin University, then Calvin College. They have a core for their general education, but all the core classes, I kept taking comm courses to fulfill requirements. And after my third of those, I met with the professor. I was like, I like my English major, but maybe I should minor in comm. And she was like, no, you should just double major. And I just accepted that. And I really loved both my majors as I moved through the curriculum. I was also quite involved in campus ministry. The comm side seemed more flexible. I could address more of the kinds of things I found most interesting. And so between that and meeting with professors, I also applied for a fellowship doing communication research and a fellowship doing ministry in the same summer. And I got one and not the other. So that felt like a kind of divine guidance. Now looking back, I think my personality is much more suited to research and teaching than direct ministry. So I think that was a good move.
For sure. And it's led, obviously, once you've gotten into this communications realm, you started thinking through some things, and eventually you started writing, based on what I was reading online about you, your a couple freelance opportunities, thinkchristian.net and unnecessaryquotes.com. How have those experiences, I guess a couple twofold. One, how did you get interested in doing that kind of thing? And two, how did those experiences shape you as a communicator?
Yeah. Well, I think the questions that I bring to communication really got applied when I started the Quotes blog, which I started my senior year in college, because the question that I brought to it was what is this medium capable of? What can we do with it? What is it good for? What is it good at? Sort of started with, what if I made a blog that was about one really specific thing? And I've talked about in other contexts, I just got really lucky with the timing that blogs were just starting to take off at about that time. Although based on my research, you could trace it all the way back to 1993, 1995. But also importantly, people started getting camera phones right then. And so they could take pictures of the unnecessary quotes and email them to me because suddenly everyone had a camera in their pocket. So also thinking about Think Christian, that is more directly related, I think, to my research and teaching, that my experience growing up in a Christian household, going to Christian schools, K through bachelor's, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we think about this stuff as a Christian? How do we take it seriously on its own terms, but also think about it with our terms, with the terms of God's story and God's relationship to people? So I was developing that muscle at college. That's what we hope all of our Christian college students do, at least certainly at Trinity and at Calvin. That's important to us. When I got to grad school, I realized that wasn't standard issue. And it was something that sort of set me apart from my classmates and something that I really enjoyed doing. I like thinking about pop culture and media. I haven't done it much lately. After having a kid, my television time got a lot more limited. that's life. But I've also felt it as kind of like a ministry or a calling, that I'm a person who has the background and the experience to sort of think these things through more quickly and maybe like with more information and context than your average person. So a colleague once said, our job is to do society's homework. Like I can provide a take or a perspective that other folks don't have time to come to because they're busy doing their jobs.
As you kind of started thinking through more broadly about, people have different communication views outside of what I have, or even different leadership views. Based on those experiences, how would you say that society views communication, or maybe some experience that you understand how others think about communication? And how can you, through leadership and communication yourself, help change that perception or encourage others in academia to change that perception?
That's tricky because I've written about this a little bit with my colleague, Craig Mattson, because I think it's very tempting to take sort of like general common sense wisdom about communication, adapt to your audience, and like baptize it or say it in Christian terms. And so I think some of my best thinking has come from engaging secular comm theory alongside the Bible, theology, and like a broad range of people thinking about these questions. So Craig and I wrote a piece. A really important influence on that work was a scholar at Wheaton. And he had a piece about this idea that like God adapts to us, that Jesus is God's audience adaptation is actually heretical, that Jesus isn't an adaptation or translation of God. Jesus is God. So we took that to say, if we think about our communication not as an adaptation of some ideal self or thought, but real presence with each other, how does that change how we think about communication? And I found that approach actually then translating back to secular contexts addresses a lot of our most pressing communication problems. Like how do we deal with cultural difference, identities, race, gender, all of that stuff? If we think about like, how can I bring my authentic self in a respectful and humble way to this real interaction with another human? That's where it gets tricky, right? You just do it. It's fine. But like starting with that question, I think has helped move between sort of, I'm really interested in the work that folks are doing on affect, and then theological approach that sort of roots me in a concept of the good life, a concept of what good communication would be or mean.
That's so good. I think understanding how Jesus is, that's something I'm kind of learning in my faith walk. Understanding of how he is and how he interacted can help really shape who we are as communicators. And I think that's certainly a big, significant detail. Who are some of the scholarly giants or the people that really influenced you in terms of your research academically as you were pursuing your degrees?
I think one of the biggest influences has been Celeste Condit. She was a faculty member in my graduate program, not a Christian herself, but I find her ideas really useful for my Christian walk. But the way that she thinks about language with just utter respect for humans as actors and the complexity of like what real people do with, and the way that she thinks about emotion and takes it seriously. One of her more recent books, it's about anger and like public emotion, really articulates rhetorical approach to thinking about emotion and affect, and then thinks about like the consequences of it for our life together. That has been hugely influential for me. Tom Lessel was my advisor. He's Catholic and also interested in the ways that religious talk, political talk, and science talk have engaged across time. He's also a great stylist. And he introduced me to Ed Black, who's kind of an older scholar, but also like really careful arguer and stylist that I really appreciate the way that he like builds an argument and does a close reading.
Yes, those influences sound really helpful. In terms of maybe, let's think within the last 5 years, maybe, are there any modern voice in communication and leadership that you currently enjoy reading or you come across? Initially, when I've been posing this question to others, I was thinking from a scholarly context, but I opened up that idea too to maybe other people just in the media in general who might be effective in their ways that they communicate.
Another scholarly example that comes to mind is Eric Jenkins has done some recent work about, he has a theory of modes that I found really helpful. And he can get a little wonky, a little up there in the theory stratosphere, but also can be really like engaging with modern technological reads, like a deep thinker and a deep feeler.
I love the quote that I found on your TCC staff profile that mentions that studying communications helps us think more about the subtle ways messages are sent and received in a community or a public, and helpfully make us more thoughtful as producers of messages. So based on that and just your general understanding and context, what do you think are the leading causes of communication being divisive today, and how has that affected educational leadership in general?
There's multiple things going on there. And I think working at a really small college, educational leadership within the context of the institution can avoid some of the bigger social problems because we all have met each other. And it's easy to walk over to someone else's office and have a face-to-face conversation. Because I think one thing that's happening, certainly in our politics and our cultural social politics, is a lot of people arguing to the void or arguing against an imaginary opponent and not a real person. I don't know how many times I have, try not to do this, but gotten into a back and forth with someone on Facebook and then they tell me what I think and they're wrong, right? People like you, blah, 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 blah. Actually, no. So I think that anticipating or imagining another person rather than being open to the reality of others is one thing that kind of creates that divisions. And then we come in already fired up about other things. And, Bakhtin says every statement is a response, some amount of that we're always responding to a lot of stuff across time and space. And I don't want to reduce communication or leadership to one-on-one dyadic communication, because I think actually public communication and mass communication can be really valuable and important. That catching an audience you weren't anticipating can be beautiful and wonderful. So that kind of openness and that idea that I can write something and launch it, or make a podcast and launch it and you never know who's going to encounter it, or a Think Christian post or whatever. But I think we run into trouble when we are imagining a dyadic conversation, but the interlocutor isn't real. I think we do better when we start with an authentic expression of the self and are honest about where we're coming from and why. And that's more winsome and ironically, I tell my public speaking students this all the time. The more specific, actually, the easier it is for other people to relate and connect to what you're saying. Even if they don't share that exact experience, they can connect their own details.
That's so good. And I was actually listening to a podcast yesterday, and they said something very similarly to what you said about how a lot of times we go into these digital arguments with this preconceived notion, this is our box and this is where we're coming from. And so we're basically trying to fit every situation that we have into this box, and instead of trying to be open-minded and be able to connect in that regard. And so that's very, very good context there for sure.
I've heard of somebody describing that as making up a person to get mad at.
I love it. Making up a person to get mad at. That is incredible. I love it. Switching gears a little bit, you've done some research on Hebrews 11 and the hero and heroism qualities tied into Star Wars. And how can and should leaders possess qualities that maybe a hero or a heroine would have?
I have not thought about it in that way. So I did that work with my dad, which was a delight. One thing that we saw both in the stories that Hebrews 11 evokes and in our engagement with Star Wars is not every hero is the upfront, out loud gold medalist. The Olympics are airing as we're recording this. And I remember joking around in past years when U.S. athletes talk to interviewers, it seems like those people forgot what movies we like. They're like, oh, in the movie about you, who would play you? Yeah, everyone loves a come from ahead story. But the stories we like to tell, right, are about the unlikely or the humble. And in the case of something I really love about Rebel One is that in some ways it's a failure story. And, there's all these little bits in the Star Wars universe and in the Bible of sort of barely mentioned whole groups of people. Many Bothans died, but also the people of Israel marching around Jericho, right? We don't know their names. We don't know their stories for most of them, but they're important. They're part of it. And so I think leadership can be the roles and the positions, the people who get the books named after them, but that's not the only way to be important, to be faithful.
You have some interesting background with the degrees you have and where you got them. So you have an interesting view of both Christian higher education and secular higher education. And so based on that understanding, does Christian leadership in your mind still have value in general society today in the 2020s? And if so, what's the best way that can be implemented?
So I have my students in comm ethics read Miroslav Volf's A Public Faith. And it's getting a little bit old. It's about 15 years old now, I think. But what I like about that book is that Volf thinks about all the ways that religion in general and also Christianity in particular have been both a source of gift and a source of like a lot of bad stuff in the world. Like in the wrong hands or in the wrong approach, religion has been the cause of a lot of wars and terror. He was writing like kind of coming out of 9/11, like the threat of Islamic terror. But as a lot of folks said at that time, like the Crusades are not better. So he thinks through like those pros and cons, then lands on saying, and I think maybe you could probably hear his influence in what I've said so far, that speaking in your own authentic religious voice, not as authority, but as a member of the democracy is what we should be doing. And we should be offering a vision of human flourishing that benefits everyone, that Christianity has something to offer to the world. And we should be trying to bring that, not dressing it up or hiding it or keeping it a secret, but offering it with open hands for what it is and among other folks' offerings and in a way that's open to learn from others as well. So that particular vision of Christian leadership, I think, has never not been important, but maybe even more so today than in the past.
I love like the democracy element of like authentic voice and like how we in our own cultures understand and like process what other people are having and create positive dialogue in that regard. So that's very, very good. What are some of the unique characteristics of being an educational leader within a small liberal arts school that one cannot experience in a different setting?
Something I really valued as a student at Calvin University and something I try to bring to my students here is a lack of defensiveness that I think it can be hard to take ideas seriously if you notice a spot where they threaten what you thought was important or the way that you had been thinking about your faith, or maybe they really are in conflict with your faith, but rather than like take them seriously, think them through, and then maybe ultimately decide that like it's not compatible and you have good reasons, like folks will get really defensive, right? And reject things out of hand or not give ideas a chance and like shut down thinking. That defensive position is not great for learning. So in a Christian context, as a student, I was able to sort of trust the process and not feel like I had to be the representative of Jesus in that space for the benefit of others. And so I hope that my students also have that kind of freedom to like hold things loosely for a minute and to believe that their faith is a strong enough set of roots or can become a strong enough set of roots to withstand a little bit of wiggle, a little bit of considering and even like reorganizing those ideas. So I think the safety of shared faith and set of assumptions can be really transformative. I don't know that it always plays out that way. And I don't think that that's impossible in a secular institution. But I have certainly encountered, when I was at Georgia, for instance, I taught a course on religious rhetoric in U.S. history. And I had a student that by midterm, instead of the paper I had assigned, wrote me about how frustrated he was that he hadn't had a chance to defend Christianity, to debate the truth of Christianity. In some ways, I was proud of that. Like, that's not what the course was. It wasn't a theology course. It wasn't a philosophy course. It was a rhetoric course. What are the consequences of these beliefs and this way of stating them? But it also reflected the expectations that he came in with, this sort of like combative, defensive mode. So I think what people come in expecting, whether or not they actually experience it at a secular university, is that sort of like God is not dead debate moment. So like setting aside that expectation, imagination of what a professor is or what learning is something a Christian school can do for Christian students that's special. And that also we can really get into it. Like, what are the consequences of this? How should Christians think about this? And I try not to be too directive in terms of like, this is the Christian answer, but I can say this is a Christian answer. So being able to like think that through, not just on my own or with my church, but with my students kind of live, is a real benefit of working at a Christian school and with my colleagues too. Some of the work that I was talking about before, it got inspired when I walked into Craig Matson's office as a brand new professor and said, I just made my public speaking syllabus and it is exactly the same as was the one from the state university. And I don't think that's what we're supposed to be doing here. So what should we do? What are we supposed to do that's different? And that ended up with, we applied funds and did this whole project. Classic professor answer, he said, well, what do you think? So like the space to do that thinking explicitly, to not like think the religious element on my own and then come back and translate it to others has been really beneficial. I think both in terms of as an educational institution and the kinds of things that I'm able to publish, but also for my intellectual development.
Having questions in response as answers to questions. Although it is a higher education thing, it's also a biblical thing. Jesus always answers questions with questions. And so sometimes that might just be a deeper way to pull information out, right? A couple more questions here. So from some of my early readings in leadership communication, one thing that I've kind of stumbled across is the importance of nonverbal communication and its importance in leadership in general. And in your opinion, does nonverbal communication deserve a lot of the attention that it seems to be getting in terms of leadership matters, or should we be focusing more on how we articulate what we're saying?
I don't think it's an either or, but I do think, there was a big move, especially when other disciplines sort of took the linguistic turn to like paying attention to words and maybe at the expense of other elements. My colleague, Jamie Landau, and I worked on a piece for a long time, actually, about a Barack Obama speech. It was the memorial service at Tucson after Gabrielle Giffords was shot. She didn't die, but several other people did. And it's weird because the affect, the emotions are all weird. He has a script that he more or less followed, but the audience, we called it boisterous enthusiasm. If you watch a video of it, it's very uncomfortable. They're like cheering and yelling. Actually, my colleague interviewed the speechwriter and he said they thought they were in the wrong place because the tone was so weird. And so all of the work that Obama did to make that speech that had been already crafted, the language, was the nonverbals, the delivery, the timing, what he did with his voice. And it could have been a mess in all kinds of ways, but he made it work in that situation. Now, I think the writing that they had prepared served to redirect. So it wasn't just the tone, but I do think that at our own peril, we miss out on things like vocal tone, vocal warmth, pace, pitch, force. And also, I would consider this part of nonverbal like kairos, which is a Greek word that means like the right time. We've been in one of our courses, we're sort of changing things around now, but for a couple semesters, reading through most of the book of Job together in class. And one thing I noticed on multiple reads of that is one of the friends says a bunch of stuff in his first speech to Job that's like, don't worry about it. God's faithful. You'll get restored. All you have to do is confess, but we know we can trust God and it'll all be okay. And then Job's response to him was basically, you're being useless right now. But what I think is interesting about that is he wasn't wrong. Like all of the things that he said were in fact true, but it was the wrong time. So what I learned from that is that good communication and part of nonverbal isn't just about saying things that are true or saying things that are crafted correctly, but saying in the right place at the right time, in the right mode, and that can be, and sometimes choosing not to speak at all.
I love that because I think sometimes it's the context of the situation. An analogy I a lot of times use in my own dialogue and examples in class, and I forget exactly who I got this from, so I can't officially credit them, which frustrates me. But the difference between the context of saying the term laying your hands on someone. So if you said that in a Christian circle, we're praying, but if you say that on the streets, then you're trying to pick a fight. It's the importance of like when and where and how you say something that can be really beneficial for sure. Christian higher education has certainly changed during really all of our careers in such a short time. Even with that short time, a lot of just private liberal arts education, let alone Christian education, financial woes, enclosures that we've been seeing left and right.
Yeah.
And so from a leadership standpoint, how can Christian educational leaders best utilize effective communication as they're navigating these specific challenges that a lot of these similar schools face?
So something that has helped me as rank and file faculty without that much power over the big forces and our institutional response to those things is just a strong sense of vocation that we're not a business. We have balance sheets and accounting and prices, and we can't ignore those material realities. And I don't think God wants us to ignore those material realities. One thing I love about the Bible is that you get these stories like the widow's oil, where it's clear that God takes our physical material needs seriously. But ultimately, my goal isn't to make money. My goal is to be a scholar in the world and to teach my students. So seeing my role and how that's a real calling from God gives me a lot of faith that even if, and I really hope that my institution continues to exist and thrive, and I'm excited about some of the strategies we're using to address that, I can trust that God's given me these talents and this experience, and I can continue to use them and should continue to use them in a way that benefits the world, regardless of what happens to institutions and sort of the forces of higher ed, which again, like not to minimize the real pain and anxiety. And we had layoffs last year that we're still sort of reeling from. So like all of that stuff is true, but also God is faithful and my vocation is bigger than a job.
Thank you to Dr. Keeley-Jonker for joining us today on the Educational Leadership series of the Minds of Meaning podcast. It was very hard to limit the list to just 3 big things, but this is what I took away the most. First, Christian education leadership environments can avoid society's communication interferences because we have all met each other. And we have a unique opportunity as educational leaders to not jump through communication barriers, to have a positive discourse of communication with our students and with our fellow faculty and staff members. Dr. Keeley-Jonker also mentioned that it is easy to try to compete in political-based arguments on social media with others facing what she calls an imaginary opponent. I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts recently, The Holy Post. They focused on the Olympics opening ceremony Last Supper depiction. Caitlin Chess, a doctorate student at Duke University in theology and author of The Ballot in the Bible, also mentioned how we want to fit every cultural issue into a box, and we try to fit every world issue into our own self-morphed lens, as opposed to trying to have a dialogue and discussion about what is currently happening in the world. And I think small liberal arts Christian colleges have a unique privilege of holding those discussions in a face-to-face sphere. Secondly, in our discussion about heroes and heroines, Dr. Keeley-Jonker mentioned how hailed characters in stories often come from failures. They often start off as people who are struggling through life and are not expected to be heroes, and then they make a series of actions that lead them to a mark of success. Now, I'm not saying that educational leaders should be encouraging their students to fail in order to succeed, but we are all imperfect beings. We've seen too often in Christian circles recently how people have used greed and are power hungry to become quote unquote heroes, which leads to eventual dismissal of their leadership roles. But what if we can communicate to these students and our peers by encouraging students to be risk takers, making mistakes along the way, and being humble in those moments as ways to continue to strive to be the best citizens possible in a complex world? Lastly, at the end of our discussion, we discuss why we do what we do as Christian higher education leaders. It's not for a specific salary. I don't think any of us would be spending our careers in Christian higher education if that was the case. However, what we are called to do is be scholars in the world and teach our students the knowledge that we gain so that they can be good stewards of their minds and hearts as they go into the world. That is it for episode number 3 of the Educational Leadership series on the Minds of Meaning podcast. This is Austin Anderson signing off. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Minds of Meaning podcast. To learn more about Minds of Meaning, visit mindsofmeaning.com or Minds of Meaning on the mainstream social media platforms. God bless.